something specific to language, like a kind of specific language acquisition device or specific grammar that enables children to learn. After all, children are learning all sorts of other things too, as we've seen. And maybe their general cognitive abilities are actually leading them to figure out language. And there are sort of two versions of this hypothesis that you could have. One version points out the fact that we don't actually learn language in isolation. We learn language. One of the things about languages mean things. Words and sentences mean things. So when we're learning to talk, a lot of times we're looking at the world, we're seeing things out in the world, and then children are figuring out what those words mean by knowing something about what the world is actually like. I don't know, have any of you ever seen the movie Splash? It's an old movie, but a really charming movie. It's about a mermaid who comes to America and, of course, falls in love and so on and so forth. And there's a wonderful section where she's actually learning to use language for the first time. She's learning English because they don't speak English under the sea. And the way that she learns English is by looking at the television. So she watches television in this New York apartment. So her first word is Bloomingdale's. She actually sees all these pictures on the television of beautiful dresses and furs and shoes. And every time that she sees any of those things, the television says Bloomingdale's. So her first word is Bloomingdale's, and that's the first thing that she wants to do. Okay, well, most people are not learning language that way. But it points out that when we are learning language, we're learning it in a rich context where words have meaning and we want to express some kinds of meanings versus other kinds of meanings. Okay, and the idea is that you might be able to use the meaning of words to sort of bootstrap your way to an understanding of how language works. And in particular, the fact that, for instance, baby looks around the world and knows, okay, these are separate objects, and these are relationships between objects, and these are objects that are important, and these are objects that aren't important. The fact that the child already understands a lot about how the world works might make it easier for him to map the words that he's hearing onto his conceptual understanding of the way the world works. And of course, the same thing's true for syntax. So having a picture of how the world works makes it easier for you to figure out how words work. And a second kind of cognitive approach to language, which is a little different, says, well, in order to learn about all sorts of things about the world, you have to find general regularities and patterns. So what I've been emphasizing is the fact that language is a system of these regularities and patterns and rules, and you have to take the evidence that you have and figure out these patterns and rules from that evidence. But of course, that's not just true about language. That's true about lots of aspects of the world. So for instance, as an example that we've given before, if I want to figure out how the people around me work, I have to do that by not just looking at what they do, but trying to figure out what regularities are going on in their minds that lead them to do the things that they do. So I understand other people by having sort of general principles like people try to get what they want. Remember the baby looking at the hand reaching for the teddy bear. Or people can see things if they're in front of them, but not if they're behind a screen and so forth. So there's an example of something quite different from language, but where we have the same problem. What we're actually just seeing is the bags of skin that are moving around, and yet we have to infer something about the underlying rules and principles that are leading people to behave in the way they do. And that's a kind of general problem that children have in many different contexts. And one of the things that people have been looking at, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, is how do children pick up the statistical patterns in language in the data that let them actually infer what the underlying rules are. And there's actually more information there in the data and in the evidence than you might think or than Chomsky thought originally. So in the book, they talk about some of this work on what's called statistical learning, where you can show that even 9-month-old babies are very, very sensitive to the patterns they hear in the words and sounds around them. And it may be that being sensitive to those patterns and then making inferences about rules from the patterns is an important part of what children do when they're trying to solve the problem of language. Is that clear to everybody? Okay. All right, let's have an explanation break and think about the differences between, so I've just outlined these negative and cognitive explanations. Why are they different from language? And maybe you should also think about how are they the same? What aspects of language are they emphasizing that are the same? Yeah. Which one?
But when you're doing the initial grades,
Yeah.
sometimes you can talk. I was listening to your.
Oh, I was talking about it. Okay.
The conversation.
Okay.
But I just one quick.
Yeah.
We had one more question. So for the cognitive approach.
let me go over it. Let me go over it again. But first, let me give you some of the evidence for the cognitive approaches that might make it easier than if we're thinking about it just abstractly, and then I'll go over what the cognitive approaches are again. So what's the basic idea? Here's the simple idea. The simple idea is the nativist approaches say language understanding is the result of something that's specifically linguistic. There's a specific language acquisition device. There's something that's in place when you're born that's just there to deal with language. It's not you. You're not using it for anything else. You're just using it to deal with language. And the cognitive approaches say it isn't that you have to have this special device that's just there to use for language. Other things that you know about the world can actually help you to solve the problem of language. Does that help make it a little more clear? And then the two cognitive approaches that I talked about, one of them says, well, what is this other thing that you know about that can help you to solve language? Well, one thing is you know about what the world around you is like, and you know that words mean things. So you could use knowing what words mean as a way of trying to figure out how the language works. Maybe think about if you were going into a foreign country and you didn't know anything at all about this language. What would you do? Well, the first thing you do is say point to something and try and get people to say what the name of it was, or you reach for something and try to communicate what it was that you're trying to say, and then listen to what they said, and then say, oh, okay, that word always shows up when there's a chair around. That word always seems to be in the sentence. So maybe that word actually means chair. Yeah.
How do any model think that what happens when it's harder for you to learn language as you get older?
Right.
It just goes away, or
In fact, that's one of the pieces of evidence that the innate module people use to support the idea that it's innate, which is they say, well, there's what's called a critical period. There's this early period when this particular ability is there, and then when you mature, your brain just changes and you can't do it anymore. And the thought is that, in fact, when you're trying to learn a language as an adult, you're having to rely on all these other kinds of more general mechanisms because the specific language mechanism isn't available to you in the same way anymore. And there's actually some evidence for that. Yeah? It's not completely that because it isn't just words. So you could also be associating syntactic structures with their meanings. So for instance, here's a good example. Think about the differences between questions and statements that I talked about last time. So if we're trying to figure out when someone says when in English, what does that mean? Well, it isn't quite that you could go out and say, oh, okay, there's always a when in the room every time that somebody says when. That doesn't make sense. But you could figure out, oh, okay, it's people asking questions about time. That's when you get the word when showing up. Right? So it isn't just as simple as just here's a word and here's the object you associate with it. It could also be, here's, say, a complicated syntactic structure, but it's associated with something like the fact that the world is organized in terms of time, and you might want to try and figure out when something happened. Is that clear? Okay, so one thing that you could actually show is that there are actually empirical links between, say, linguistic and conceptual development. And in fact, there's some interesting evidence for this. So remember I was saying about the children learning all the different word endings? Well, there's some evidence that word endings that map onto things that children understand really well, like having two of things versus one of something, are acquired earlier, whereas word endings that map onto things that are more complicated, like the past, or even like some of these really complicated things like our aspect system, the difference between I went to the store and I have gone to the store, right? That's a really complicated, kind of tricky distinction to make. We all kind of have a sense that it means something different, but it's tricky about what it means. Those things seem to be harder for children to learn, and they learn them later than the things like saying that there's two chairs versus one chair that seem to map very well onto something that babies already know about even before they learn language. Is that clear to everybody? And in fact, the work that I did when I was first starting my career was exactly about showing that if you looked at children's understanding of things like objects appearing and disappearing, something we talked about in the last chapter, that was connected to when they started to use words like all gone, which my grandson started to use. Another kind of evidence is that there's actually some nice empirical evidence of early statistical learning. So this is work that's described in detail in the book by people like Jenny Safran at Wisconsin, where they actually gave babies statistical patterns, like ba ba ga ba ga ga ba ba ga, a whole string of sounds that had a particular pattern not obvious to you. And they showed that the babies could actually pick out those patterns from those sounds. And interestingly, it might be that that's just an example of one of these language-specific abilities, but then they did exactly the same experiments, but now instead of using ba and ga, they used musical notes, or they used pictures showing up on the screen. And the babies could extract the patterns from the musical notes or from the pictures the same way that they could extract the patterns from the language syllables that they heard. And that suggests that there's this general pattern extraction mechanism they're using to try to get to help solve the problem of language, but that they can also use to help figure out how music works or help figure out the regularities in the visual world. Is that reasonably clear? Yeah? Oh, yeah, that's a good question, and it's a little complicated. They described the experiments actually in the book, but basically what they did was they showed the children, had the children listen to a whole lot of these syllable strings, and there was a pattern in it. For instance, pa always came after ga, but it never came after ba. Simple pattern. And they heard all these pa ga ba 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 ga ga ga, but the principle was that pa always came after ga and never came after ba. And then what they did was they gave the children new strings to listen to that either followed the pattern or didn't follow the pattern. So I can't do this off the top of my head, but you get the idea. So you hear, pa ga ba or ga ba ba, and one of them fit the pattern that they heard and one of them didn't. And then they used that habituation technique to see if the babies listened longer to the ones that were unexpected, to the ones that violated the pattern. And sure enough, when you do this, amazingly, 7-month-old babies will actually listen longer to the new sounds that don't fit the pattern than they will to the sounds that do fit the pattern. Even though they've never actually heard those particular sounds before, they recognize that they're violating the pattern that they've heard. Yeah? Yeah, that's a good point. So one way that you could think about the language, the nativist idea is that, here's one version of it. You could say, well, it's there to begin with, but what's there to begin with isn't specific to language, it's these more general kinds of cognitive capacities. So that would be a kind of nativist, but not language-specific version of the hypothesis. That's just not the way that it's played out. Usually the way it plays out is that people who think there's something that's very specific to language also think that it's something that's there from very early. But you're right, there isn't an absolute necessary reason why those two things should be connected to one another. That's just sort of the way it's played out with the actual theories. The important difference is the nativists think that there's very specific structure, very specific to language, and it's there from the beginning. It's not something that you learn. And the cognitive approaches think, no, you really do learn that structure, and you learn it by using a lot of the kind of information that you use for other purposes, that you use for general cognitive development. Is that clear? Is that clear? I think people are still looking muddled. What cognitive scientists? Okay, so the cognitive view, what a cognitive view thinks is that in its strongest form, what the cognitive view thinks is there's nothing special about language. When children are learning language, they're using the same kinds of techniques that they use to learn about everything else in the world. There's nothing particular to language that makes language special. The same kinds of knowledge, one thing they're using is they're using all the things that they know about the world, and they're using that to map onto the meanings of words. And the other thing is that they're using their general pattern recognition abilities, and they're using that to figure out the patterns that are there in language. Yeah? Right. Well, that's one of the big debates. So one of the big questions is, when they found that family, was it really something that was just specific to language? And notice it wasn't just language in general. It was this very specific thing about being able to use word endings. Or could it be that it's something like sequencing sounds in a particular order that was also an issue with these children? And I think it's fair to say that there's a big debate about it. If there weren't obvious things, like it wasn't obvious that their IQ was any different and they didn't have hearing problems, but there may have been something that was more subtle that was going on about the way that they were, say, processing sounds that was responsible for them having this kind of disorder. Okay, let me just quickly, maybe we'll do a little bit next time, talk about, we have another approach, and we have 1 minute to talk about it. Just to say the other approach, the social interactionist approach, says that points out the fact that language isn't just something that you're using in isolation, you use it in a social setting. So you're actually using it to communicate with other people, and other people are using language to communicate with you. So you're actually interacting with people socially as you learn language. And again, there are sort of 2 versions of this that you might have. So again, the idea would be, it's not just your language-specific abilities that lead to language. You also have all these other abilities to interact with other people and to live in a social world, and maybe those are the other abilities that are helping you to learn language. And that seems plausible because, after all, language is involved in communication. And I mentioned that language has this pragmatics about how you communicate, when you communicate, and what's appropriate and what isn't. So one idea would be, maybe if I understand about communication in general, and I'm trying to communicate in general, that general communication ability is helping me to actually solve the specific language problem. And then the last sort of version of the social interactionist approach is that adults are actually providing support for language to children. So it isn't that the children are just sitting there listening to the transcript of the Rob Blagojevich trial and trying to figure out how language works from that. In fact, caregivers are doing things that actually make it easier for children to learn language. And the most famous example of this is something called motherese. That's the fact that when moms are talking to babies, they use this special weird voice. So they say, "Oh, you're my sweet adorable baby, aren't you? You're my baby," which is incredibly embarrassing. I can only do it by imagining that I have all these sitting in front of me. And it turns out that that funny speech actually gives children a lot of cues to language that they wouldn't get if they were just hearing regular speech. So those are both ways that social interactions and social relationships can give you more information to solve the language problem.